Eduardo to stop by. He came here last year to talk about debt management and a little bit about Argentina. But I think understanding how Argentina reaches December and the new government takes over, in what conditions the Argentinian economy will be, and what are the options for the next administration depending on who wins the October and November elections, first round in October, second round if needed in November. I think it's very good to have one of the leading Argentinian economists. Eduardo is now advising one of the main parties, one of the main candidates in the campaign. And I think we will have, obviously the opportunity to hear from him and to ask questions on what he's expecting the economy to look like in December and what are the options for the next government. Eduardo is the Dean of the School of Government at Di Tella University, one of the leading universities in Argentina. He was an advisor to the President of Argentina, to the previous President of Argentina, putting together an agenda for Argentina 2030. I think thinking that the stabilization problem would have been solved by now, maybe focusing on other issues, but it seems that the agenda for Argentina 2030 is the same than Argentina 2020, Argentina 2010, no? Some of these problems have not been solved, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. He has been the head of LATAM research at Barclays Bank, and he was the chief economist of the Central Bank of Argentina at the beginning of the 21st century. So I think we have the perfect guest to talk to us about what's coming for the Argentinian economy. And just as another news, we will have another session on Argentina focusing more on the politics on October 5th when Rodrigo Sarazaga visits Georgetown. So with that, let me welcome Eduardo again, and we're very eager to hear you.
I'm an engineer by trade, so I'm very linear and disciplined. So I follow the cues that Alejandro gave me for the talk with a number of questions, and I have my memoir here, which I'll proceed to accommodate. Because one thing that you have to bear in mind in Argentina is that we're always overwhelmed by the present, and sometimes that means that having the crisis in your face gives you a loss of perspective, and you end up thinking that we are always in the same situation. Take, for example, the inflation problem. In Argentina, many people think that we have been having high inflation forever, for ages. And people tend to forget that from 2002 to 2005, we have around 3 to 5% inflation per year. So we actually managed many times to stabilize the economy. We are terribly bad at maintaining the stabilization, but stabilizing is not an issue. It's not that we have been having inflation for 50 years. We recreate inflation. We had twin surpluses in 2002 through 2006 probably, and we were growing at what we call Chinese growth rates. That was not so high, but we were recovering from a crisis. So we were in a good position less than 20 years ago, right? So this is important to bear in mind, because when you think about stabilization, it's not exactly lowering inflation, but actually preserving the stabilization over the years. The key question here, why we can't manage to preserve stabilization once you lower it. Stabilization goes too high. It's not that difficult to bring down. What's difficult is to actually stay there for at least 2 decades. With that introduction, the first question we have to make, at some point, Argentina looks like a very specific case from a comparative historical perspective. Right? There is an apocryphal, I think, attributed to Simon Kuznets, a phrase saying that there are 4 types of countries, developed, underdeveloped, Japan and Argentina. And of course, this is a simplification, but the idea that Argentina is a special case is something that's always in the minds of Argentinians, which is not necessarily a good thing. If you think of when we actually started to diverge, because the idea, the myth in Argentina is that we're rich and we're poor, and somehow in the middle we lost our track. And when we start thinking of where we diverged, there's a long discussion attributing this to populism typically associated with the Peronist Party, or to a model of import substitution that failed by the late 60s. And we have been doing actually, that's why I brought the subject, we have been doing with a couple of friends a econometric study trying to see where is the divergence point. And the divergence point is 1949, 1950, what we found, really. My point here is that that's not really relevant, because if something happened 80 years ago, almost 80 years ago, that cannot explain why we're still here, right? We cannot attribute this to historical events or choices that were made 75 years ago. So looking for an historical predetermined fact, the idea that Argentina has something wrong, something different from the rest of the countries, I think is misleading. Because it's not something, there should be something that we have been doing wrong in the past 15 years. It cannot be something that dates back to the post-war, okay? Now, there are a number of hypotheses of why we are so bad at preserving stability and growing in a sustainable, modest but sustainable path. And I will drop a couple of these hypotheses, because when we get to the present and we go through what would a stabilization plan next year look like, my key question will be, what, if we are successful stabilizing, what should we do to keep it there, right? To start growing slowly and steadily from there. So what are the hypotheses? What are the triggers of our sort of inherent stability? Well, some people say that we have an early success that created too early an excess demand. And we have been talking with Alex about that. We have social programs and social protection of a developed country, but we have income and fiscal revenues and tax system and institutions of the developing countries, and mismatch there that typically reflects, at the end of the day, in a chronic deficit that fuels an excessive monetization and inflation, and a distributed struggle that creates both polarization and high volatility, right, between governments that defend, governments that are more pro-growth and governments that are more pro-distribution. That's one of the hypotheses, right? And it's still going around, because if you look at the contracts between the Macri administration and the recent Alberto Fernandez's administration, you see some of the struggle, right? Macri was more pro-growth, although he didn't really prove to be so reformist at the end. He was more pro-growth, whereas this government was more pro-distribution. And this pendulum, whoever is right, I'm not taking sides here, although I have my own preferences, that pendulum creates a volatility that makes it very difficult for investment and long-run planning to actually develop. Right? It doesn't matter who's actually right. The fact that we have such a dispersion and volatility in policies, I think, is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to find a growth path. Now, there is a question here to which I would like to come back, and has to do with, again, the uniqueness of the Argentine case. Because this distributional struggle, maybe with some differences, we are starting to see the same in other countries in the region. So there is a pending question, underlying question, that whether Argentina is actually, to some extent, a leading case or a leading indicator of what other countries like Peru, Chile, or Colombia, or even Brazil to a certain extent, might be in 10 or 20 years' time. Then there is another thing that's important to understand. In Latin America, and Chile, and Argentina in particular, we are poor but democratic. So, if you look at the South Asian miracles, most of them were not due to, but were allowed because of the, I would say, authoritarian or context, if not the direct, straight-out dictatorships, right? In Argentina, and mostly many of these Latin American countries I mentioned before, minorities, interest groups are very vocal, and they express very clearly their demands. And being a democracy, whoever wins has to some extent, represent these demands, right? So it's the emergent of different demands that are very strong, and to some extent are hard to reconcile with the limited resources of this government, particularly in Argentina. Argentina, now we have more resources because we hiked tax rates very dramatically during the 2000s, but still we're lacking resources, and therefore we have the fiscal deficit and monetization that I mentioned before. So the fact that we have a vocal democracy potentiates and increases this distributional struggle that I mentioned before. And that has economic consequences, political, social, but particularly economic consequences. This volatility, this pendulum between different types of policies that I mentioned before, including the exchange rate policy, right? We have an evaluation would be a pro-growth policy, and exchange rate policy would be more a distributional policy, and our volatility in terms of exchange rate reflects to some extent this pendulum dimension. And then, of course, there is the discussion or the hypothesis or conjecture that what's our big mistake or our main drawback is the entrenched populism that in Argentina is typically associated with Peronism, right? And it's not only Peronism. This is important to bear in mind, because now that we are facing an election in which an outsider like Javier Milei has very good chances. Now today is the most likely winner of the current electoral campaign. Milei is being a outright populist, outsider populist. You know, the fact that he's actually overpowering the Peronist populism to some extent is telling us that we have populism, populism not the prerogative of only one political party, right? It's something that's more associated with the demands of the society. It's actually more general than just one particular party that was created, in the pre-war period. Now, with that introduction, let me come back to the present. If we had to simplify to the most degree the situation in Argentina, the economic situation in Argentina, I would say that our symptoms are typically associated with inflation and dollar shortages. These are the two main symptoms of many other risks, many other causes that I will be talking about. I mentioned before, I will develop in a minute. We have a battered peso. Our currency, the peso, is highly volatile. The demand for a peso is declining, and people, for the past, I would say, at least 50 years, have been saving typically in dollars, so we don't have the use of the peso as a result of the currency is virtually nil. And because the peso is in such a weak situation, we are always relating or resorting to a dollar anchor to reduce inflation, but the result of the dollar anchor gave us sort of a vicious circle in which the dollar is always appreciating because it's used as an anchor, or at the time at which the anchor explodes because of the currency crisis, a collapse of either a crawling peg or any type of conventional peg, or simply because you have appreciated the currency too much, you have a huge currency crisis. So if I were an investor here thinking in terms of my willingness to export abroad, I would look at the exchange rate, the expectation of exchange rate in 5 years or 10 years, and the distribution would be my model, right? The peso would be, in real terms, either too appreciated to export or in the middle of a crisis, right? So that creates implicitly a situation with exporters are typically punished, and naturally the businessmen are more oriented towards the local market and favor protection. But at the end of the day, we end up with something I would call an anti-export coalition, an anti-export political coalition. Right? So our main businesses are more oriented towards the domestic market. The way in which they interact with the public sector is to fight for, to negotiate different degrees of protection, commercial protection, subsidies, subsidized credit, etc., at the expense of the exporting sector that is essentially comprised of agricultural products that can go anywhere else, and it's been typically taxed to cross-subsidize this domestic market-oriented production, and more recently, services, particularly knowledge services, that can be easily rerouted to some other countries. And that's something I have been seeing recently, where producers of knowledge services either exporting under the radar, unregistered exports, or moving to Uruguay, Paraguay, or Madrid, or even here. So this is sort of the key problem, the key symptoms that we are facing right now, that at the end of the day are behind the fact that we have exchange rate controls, and then currently an appreciating exchange rate that sooner or later, everybody's saying sooner or later will be corrected upwards, and high inflation that tends to be the flip side of a central bank that tends to finance the public deficit simply because we lack other alternative sources of finance. The monetary policy is financing the public deficit, and it's increasing inflation that fuels back into, feeds back into these expectations of exchange rate corrections in the future. To that, in the past probably 5 years, we have to add to this situation what I call the discontent with liberal democracy. That's actually making the standard political parties more difficult to negotiate these situations, pass out of this situation, right? But not this discontent with liberal democracy is, I would say, orthogonal to the traditional, more linear polarization we were talking with Giuseppe before coming here, between right and left. If you look at the voting base of Javier Milei, it's very difficult to attribute these voters ideologically. There are guys that are clearly attracted by alt-right motive, anti-woke policies, but then we have the people that used to vote for the Peronist in the slums, very low-income, marginalized people, informal workers, the Venezuelans driving a Rappi, we call it Rappi, I don't know what it's called here, Instacart, whatever, the guys that do the delivery guys, which are almost the most precarious way of regular jobs that we can find in countries like Argentina. Those, I don't say massively, but they're mostly voters of this new outsider, right? So the divide is no longer right or left, there's something else going on that's reflecting a change that you see also in countries like Chile, possibly Colombia, Peru to a lesser extent, which is people that are angry with the system that didn't deliver. Let's simplify it in that way, right? Why am I saying this? Because to the traditional ways in which we think of stabilization in Argentina, we have to factor in a new zeitgeist, a new way in which people think and vote. For instance, we have a fiscal deficit, and traditional economists like myself, I would say, the way in which you fix that is by broadening the tax base, by formalizing an economy that is probably 40–50% informal. Now, Milei's voters, they don't see formalization as an aspirational goal. They prefer to be informal. These are people that felt frustrated by the state, by the public sector, and their claim is essentially, look, I don't want to have anything to do with the state. I don't want to pay taxes. I don't want to be formalized. I don't want your benefits. I don't want your rights. But just leave me alone. Which is, from a public policy perspective, very hard to incorporate in a socially sensitive stabilization plan, because these guys are, first of all, because they don't believe that we can do better. But second, these guys are favoring a non-cooperative solution to the long-standing stagnation of Argentina. They don't want to be formalized. They don't want to help. They don't want to. They react negatively to, for instance, any traditional labor agenda that looks forward towards new ways of the self-employed having, for instance, labor benefits. They're not interested in that. So it makes the new cycle much more difficult for traditional parties to create a platform that is attractive for these people, because the people really, the only thing that they want is someone that let them be as they are right now. Right? When you lose all hope, the best that you can do is essentially adopt some defensive policy like the ones you see that are underlining this outsider, the campaign of this outsider, Milei. One of the questions that Alex was asking me as a prompt was what will happen from now on, until the next government. I don't know how closely you are following Argentina these days, but you probably have heard that we have growing inflation. Inflation is around 10 to 12% this month, and probably the next one. We have a widening deficit because the current Minister of Economics is also the candidate for the presidential candidate of the current incumbent government, and we have exchange rate controls that are essentially tightening the access to import dollars. That means that the imports are being restricted, and that has a direct impact on economic activity because imports are essentially imported inputs for economic production. And the situation right now is something like this. If you imagine that you're in the middle of an Indiana Jones movie and you're on a hanging bridge, and on the other hand there is the next government sort of holding one of the extremes of the bridge. 2 months ago, 1 month and a half ago, people were thinking that the center-right coalition, Juntos por el Cambio, is going to take charge in a few months. So that expectations anchored a situation that was extremely fragile. After the primary election, when Milei showed up as the most likely candidate to take over in December, it is like the guy that's actually holding the bridge on the other hand is starting to shake it a little bit because nobody knows what the guy is going to do, right? So that anchor is actually failing now. That's what is driving the higher market pressure, the decline in the widening of sovereign debt spreads, which is, today I was checking before coming here, is still widening to levels that are 200, probably it's 2,400 or 2,500, I don't know right now. But we are extremely high, and it's getting our chances to regain access to international markets even farther away. And we also have high inflation, a lot of investment has been stopped because of this increased uncertainty, and obviously there's a lot of political reaccommodation. Many people in the establishment are getting closer to Milei simply because they think that the guy is going to be president. So we're still in this hanging bridge, but the bridge is moving much faster right now. On top of that, we have a political party that is trying to win an election. So this is difficult to explain that the current government is actually borrowing from the next government in many ways. They are promising tax cuts for the next period that they are implementing right now to win votes. They are allowing imports to import without settling the score, the exchange rate score. Right now, it's something that the dollar will have to be paid, from December onwards. And they are stopping the adjustment of the electricity rates, so we're increasing the subsidy bill. That at some point they were adjusting that. One of the main reasons we have a deficit is because we have a very heavily subsidized energy and transportation. They started to reduce and to revise those subsidies in the context of an IMF program, but right now, after the IMF program dispersed the last tranche this year, the subsidies started to increase very dramatically. And there are a number of other things that they can do. For instance, they can sell dollars in the futures market. They can engineer one-off transfers to retired people or through social programs that are going to be dispersed in a month or two, and will have an impact on fiscal deficit and inflation starting December. So we have one candidate that doesn't have a plan, or at least doesn't have a visible plan by the end of the year, and the other candidate, the incumbent that is actually worsening the situation in the future in exchange for a few votes at the present, right? So the situation is getting increasingly fragile for the next government, and this is going to last for possibly another 2 months because we have a first round in October. That's not going to be decisive. Probably we'll need a second round of ballotage in November, and the government takes over in December. So that's where the situation is right now. What can we do to manage this situation? Well, let me tell you something. I spent the whole morning talking with people here of different international financial institutions. I don't want to be too specific about the different ways to tackle this situation. And the short answer is, any single proposal that we put on the table has a very, very high risk of malfunction, of falling into a crisis. If you ask me what's the most likely thing to happen if Milei wins, well, you can think of what happened when President Menem took office by mid-1989 without a program, that is, without the program that he was pushing during the campaign. It was a marketing program, and spent 20 months essentially with two hyperinflations, one default on the domestic debt, the securitization of deposits and central bank debt that happened in 1990. And after two hyperinflation of the domestic debt default, he found a way to stabilization through a currency worth called convertibilidad in Argentina. So, and this guy, Menem, has a party, had a reasonably good technical team, and had 6 years. And by that time, most of our workers were registered, so we could actually do some income policies that we, at the current context, we cannot do because half of our active workers are actually working under the radar. They are self-employed or informal. So if you want to engineer an income policy to reduce the impact of high inflation on the real incomes of the lower income people, we don't have any way to access them. The same way as we didn't have any way to protect them during the pandemic because the transfer go only to the upper half. So the situation can be dramatically different if we have improvisation by the end of this year relative to what it was in 1989, and even then it was, I would say, 20 months of something of a nightmare. Now, if our coalition or a reasonable economic team comes to the place, even in that case, the situation would be extremely difficult. We have to do at least 4 things to stabilize the economy. We have to reduce the fiscal deficit, which nobody knows where it will end up being because of the recent measures, but it will be close to 4 to 5% passive deficit. The fiscal deficit that you would have if no measures are undertaken. That's simply because much of the contraction of this year is essentially associated with the acceleration of inflation. If inflation stops growing, then most of this dilution actually comes back and reverts and increases the deficit. So you would have to have a fiscal adjustment of around 3 to 4%. You would need to have a monetary program with the independent central bank that basically targets inflation and nothing else. You would need to have an income policy at least to mitigate the effect of the typically higher inflation at the beginning of stabilization plan because of the adjustment exchange rate, and you would need to regain access to international finance in order to avoid the default. Probably not in 24, but in 25 when you start paying the debt that was restructured in 2020 and pushed forward 4 years. 4 ingredients of a stabilization plan that are extremely difficult to push forward, particularly because in a context in which wages and pensions are in historical lows, and we have been running a contraction, a crisis, having been a crisis for 5 years, plus 2 years of the pandemic. The next government will be probably politically relatively weak because it won't have majority in the chambers. And we have a number of debts, undocumented debts, that we still don't know how to manage, particularly these dollars that were promised imports and importers and are still to be delivered in a context, as I mentioned, that the central bank that doesn't have sufficient reserves to pay for the reserve requirements of deposits. We have right now an estimated net reserves of around minus 5 billion, minus 6 billion. Probably will get worse in the next 2 months. So, is it doable? Yes, probably, but the chances that this goes wrong or that some adjustment to the plan has to be done in the process is extremely high. The likelihood that you can get out of this mess without incurring in a credit event or forcing some deviation from a market-friendly solution are relatively high. And the time that you have to procrastinate or to try different things is zero because you don't have any financing. So you have to start adjusting the fiscal policy right away since the very first day. Now, this would be the stabilization plan. On top of that, you have to develop the reforms that were lacking in the previous stabilization efforts, like, in the Plan Austral in Argentina have hyperinflations in the 80s, and Plan Austral in the 85 was successful in bringing down inflation a few notches, but then it failed because no reform was instrumented, and the fiscal deficit, ultimately conspired against the success of the plan. Convertibility brought forward some reforms, but after some years, the government prioritizes re-election of incumbent and started increasing fiscal deficit even during growth years, and that ended up in one of the most serious crises that Argentina faced in its economic history. In 2002, we actually brought down inflation, as I mentioned, but then the Kirchner government started spending away all the buffers built during the crisis, and we ended up having inflation and a recession. We have been stagnating in real per capita terms for the past 12 years. So we need to implement these reforms in order to lock the results of the stabilization, if we get the stabilization in place. And that entails a social security reform, which is extremely complicated because we have three-pillar social security system, right? The contributive pillar, also the universal pillar, and then there is several special regimes that are extremely deficitary. And then we need a tax reform and a fiscal responsibility law and a state reform and a labor reform as well, to include all these workers I mentioned before outside the regular labor market. Not only because we want to include them, but also because we want these workers to work in more productive jobs. That the same people who work in more productive jobs mean greater growth. And I would dare say that this is probably the most important hanging fruit in terms of growth opportunity we have right there. Many workers that are doing shitty jobs that may be retrained and included in companies that are formalized and gaining productivity. And I'll always say the same. In the case of Israel in the 2000s in particular, is the example that comes to mind when they included some of the more religious people into the labor market, and the Arab people, the Arab population in Israel, also in the labor market, increasing effective hours for the same people, the same population. So there are a number of reforms that you can do during the stabilization. If you stabilize, you can think of that as a window of opportunity to start pushing these reforms. And the idea being that if you come from inflation at 10% per month to 3% per month, that gives you some popular support to start pushing for the other reforms in order to have something that's a little bit more persistent that passes stabilization. Now, I don't want to sound too pessimistic. This is perfectly doable. We have a number of silver linings here. Next year we'll have 25 to $30 billion more in our current account because of the recovery from the draft this year, plus some important savings in energy imports. And we have huge stock of dollar savings by Argentinians abroad that, if this stabilization effort is convincing, at least a minor pine will start dropping in, and that makes a lot of difference in terms of the foreign exchange market. We have a number of, not squandered, but unused opportunities that we have been ignoring in the past 15 years. That means that we have, even before starting to grow, we can actually rebound, just recovering the missed opportunities. We have, for instance, a mining stock that we haven't been exploiting. Other countries, Chile and Peru, have been doing that for at least 1 decade. So the thing that we haven't done, if we start doing that, if this investment start coming to the country, that means that we have an immediate rebound. That is estimated to be 15 to 20% in real terms. So if we stabilize the economy, there is a rebound. In fact, that's what I meant by binary. If we don't do anything, we go straight to a crisis. If we do something and we are minimally successful, then the chances are that we start rebounding without even starting to grow, even before investment in human and physical capital starts to bring fruit. So we are really at the crossroads right now. Now, having said that, the situation it's very difficult, and as I was trying to explain this to you and before to other people, it's very difficult for me to think how all these ingredients can come into place at the same time in a reconciled way so that we actually see through the crisis. It's something like a clockwork type of mechanism you need to put in place. And the key issue here is important to think this, I would say, in terms of the Anna Karenina principle. If you have to do these 6, 7, 8 things that I mentioned before, if you do 6 out of 7, 7 out of 8, that's not enough. You need to have everything in place simultaneously during the first year. I don't know whether this sort of paints a complete panorama, but at least gives you the idea of the complexity we have in hand. And can it be done? Yes. Do we need to have contingent plans in case some of these pieces don't fall through? Yes, for sure, of course. And that's how policy works. You never go with one plan. Will this happen if a populist government comes into place with no plan already prepared and start improvising like men in 1989? For sure not. So chances that we go back to our hyperinflation slash default period again next year is, let's say, proportional to the chances that the reasonable coalition wins the elections. I'll stop here because I want to hear your questions. Thank you.
So after that very uplifting message, let's take some questions from the audience, and then I can ask you some questions. You have a question over there.
Hello, thank you for being here today. I wanted to ask a little bit about the potential for other currencies as kind of a medium for exchange. I think back when Lula visited in China, there was a conversation about using reais and not using US dollar as an intermediary currency. Is there any, what do you think the effect of not using the dollar as an intermediary currency will have on the foreign exchange market in regards to the peso?
Is there other question? So let's take that.
We are already doing that because as we run out of financing sources, we engage into we start using one of the many currency swaps that the Bank of China offers to the world. I mean, the Bank of China has currency swaps with many countries, including some of Latin America, including Brazil. But we're the ones that are actually using this. We activated this to intervene in the foreign exchange market. And the last time, the Chinese actually asked us, if you want to use it, you have to use it in the bilateral trade. So we're starting to use the renminbi as a trade currency with China. I think that the effect of that, apart from the fact that that particular case reduces the dollar shortage, essentially because China is essentially one additional source of finance, and it's a perfect substitute of dollars in that particular use. The effect of changing the currency of using international trade is marginal because it's still a foreign currency. So the fact that we are not borrowing in dollars and borrowing in renminbi for us in terms of the foreign currency exposure is exactly the same. The renminbi is relatively stable with the dollar, and if we devalue with the dollar, we'll be devaluing with the renminbi. We have exactly the same balance sheet effect and negative impact on our level of indebtedness. So I think it makes sense. It's an interesting question in the discussion and the debate on international finance. In our case, I think it's relatively marginal. It doesn't really make any difference.
Hi, thank you for being here. So it's been pondered that there will perhaps be a geopolitical alignment in Argentina, say Bullrich or Milei is elected. And what I'm wondering is like if there was a significant shift in lithium production in the country, trying to deviate from China and trying to have like go to more Western sources of production, how much backlash would there be from the business elite that actually controls the lithium and the production and the packaging and the entire supply chain? Like how difficult would it be to change?
But currently, first of all, we are not producing that much lithium. We produce more. Second, of our strategical minerals, I think copper is the one that's more important, has larger upside, and that's where the investment is coming. It's going to come in the next few years. Now, the current production is not monopolized by an elite. Actually, it's relatively, because lithium are smaller operations, you know. So we have, I think, 8 or 10 companies from Canada. There are some Chinese companies. There is one Australian company. So I think only the Americans have problems getting into the country because of the controls and some, well-intentioned regulations they have here. But there is nothing like an elite owning the lithium, really. So, and the public sector has some incidents in the way this investment proceeds and the way lithium is managed because it's a strategic input. So I don't think there is an elite that's being threatened by any geopolitical change. Now, I do know that the Americans actually care about Argentina mainly because of the influence of China, economic and geopolitical terms, so they are interested in the Chinese not monopolizing the production of lithium. That's not happening, that's not going to happen, regardless of who wins. And the same goes to certain technology like 5G or access to grains through the hidrovia, which is sort of the water way to the production of crops. But I think Argentina, this is interesting. Regardless of who was in power, Argentina has been able to balance between the US and China. I think everybody understands that that's the way to do it, without taking sides in the current economy.
Eddie?
Very interesting talk. Thank you very much. But one thing that I think is always on the horizon is Vaca Muerta, right? And energy and all of that. And I wonder how that might affect the possibility of Argentina perhaps less subventions or whatever, or at least production on its own, so it's not using foreign currency for gas and things like that. Will that have an influence?
Yes, definitely. In Argentina, the problem with dollars is not necessarily, not primarily a real problem. It's not the current account deficit problem. It's more like people like dollars, so we have a capital account outflow, private outflow, that lead us sometimes to a crisis, a currency crisis, even in the context of a current account surplus. So, but that said, the fact that you have a current account surplus obviously helps you calm down the demand for dollars, the speculative or the safe demand for dollars. So, and in that sense, that's what it meant by the improved current account surplus next year. We will have an inherited deficit from this year, which is part of this mining that the current government is doing relative to the next one. But at the same time, we'll have a better production from Vaca Muerta. It's been actually lowering costs very dramatically. It's very close to the cost that we have here in the US. And that has two benign effects. One is, a lesser dollar shortage. The other one is a lower subsidy, because the subsidy is relative to the cost of production. Cost of production have been dropping very rapidly. So Vaca Muerta is one of the pillars. The point with Vaca Muerta is there are people that actually renege of the importance of Vaca Muerta, and there are people that think that this is a silver bullet. It's neither. It's something that will be very important to stabilize the dollar market, away from this case in which we have constantly having FX pressure and the need to put controls and to interfere with markets. But then we have to do all the rest. So it's one of the pillars. It's not enough, but it's going to be important. That and the mining are going to be sources in the medium term, 2, 3, 4 years. And Vaca Muerta immediately is already producing. That will relax a little bit the constraints and allow us to implement the reforms we need to reform.
Another question? There's a question there at the back, and then we'll take this one.
Hi, thank you for coming. I had a question. You mentioned Argentinians' dollar savings abroad during your presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how much that accounts to and the circumstances under which those dollars could come back to Argentina.
Yes, nobody knows how many dollars we have abroad. I mean, there are some calculations that are very rough. They say that they're from 200 billion to 400 billion. It's a lot. It's not proportionally. I mean, we are probably proportional to relative to any measure, any normalization. We are way off charts relative to other Latin American countries, other developing countries. And sort of a glimpse of that this stock was visible during the tax amnesty in 2016 and 17, whereas I think a little bit more than $100 billion were registered, that were under the radar, were unregistered before. So, and it was just a part of it. And since, I would say, it's the last 4 years, when this government started taxing those stocks, Argentinians started informalizing their stocks very rapidly, and they know how to do that because we've been there before. So, so it's a lot of money. Now, when we had the tax amnesty, only a very small portion of these dollars came to the country. So it's not only they have to register, because it's still outside. It's some dollars that are in mutual funds and treasuries and real estate investment abroad. So that doesn't actually help us a lot. Although if you have a tax on those stocks, you may gain some money. Trying to tax those stocks actually self-defeating, because what you're doing is you're reducing the tax base. The Laffer curve, this idea of that if you increase the taxes, you lower the base, works very well with these external assets because they are very simple to move and to hide. So the idea is to bring part of these dollars domestically, and for that you need to make it clear for these investors that they can make money with those dollars. Otherwise, nobody brings dollars to a country. The investor only needs to know that they can make money, but don't make money immediately. Make money over time. So convertibility risk, confiscation risk are always more important than the immediate return that you offer this capital. If you sink the capital and then you cannot get it out once the investment matures, then nobody will put some money there. Now, those risks are endogenous, and that's what's making it more complicated, because if you're in the middle of a crisis, you impose controls. So the idea is that you have to put out a plan that allows the investors to think that the crisis is highly unlikely. All other promises, if they're inconsistent with the fact that you have a high crisis propensity, will be material to attract investors. So you have to actually show that you are in a path that can elude the next crisis. If that's so, then investment will come, but it will come after you show the risk.
That was, I think, another question. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. In your opinion, what could be a good way to stop inflation and to motivate Argentinians to trust in the local currency? It's complex.
No, I mean, some people believe that we can't do that. Some people have thrown away the towel long ago. I tell you two things. One is an anecdote. There was a central bank in 2002. People were convinced that we are going straight to hyperinflation or endogenous dollarization, that people would repudiate the peso after just dropping the one-to-one peg. And they were calling for hyperinflation. They were calling for dollarization, the euro dollarization. They were also proposing offshoring our banks, or proposing a bank at Simon, narrow banking, something very extreme. Nobody has tried that before. And then we stabilized. By the end of the year, we had 3% inflation rate, a 3% annual inflation rate, and nobody was talking about dollarization. So, obviously this crisis has, again, brought dollarization and alternative ways of repudiating or changing your currency back to the forefront. And right now, if you ask me whether I can convince people that the peso will survive, it's going to be tough, right? have to show it in practice. With words, it's very, very difficult. Now, people change their views very rapidly. And one thing you have to bear in mind is that there are two ways in which you can think of the exchange rate. Right? If you think in terms of saving unit of account, well, that would take a lot. Think that, for instance, in Peru, they had 10, 15 years of peso of their local currency appreciation, and after that, they started to gradually de-dollarize savings because people started seeing that they were losing money, right? But it was 10 years after that. Uruguayans had tried to do that, and they failed. They still have a very high degree of dollarization of savings. Now, I'm more worried about the dollarization of transactions and the unit of account and the pass-through of exchange rate to inflation, because that it conspires, again, the capacity of the central bank to run monetary policy and makes you more inflationary. So it's a vicious circle, right? And so my first concern would be for people to start to remonetize their transactions, right? Our demand for money had gone down from 8% of GDP to now it's currently 3%, maybe a little bit more. So you have to start using the currency without fear of being diluted by inflation. And that would take lowering inflation. You have to lower inflation. Right? So that comes after. There's no word that can create trust in the currency. The fact that inflation goes from 10 to 3% and then to 2%, and after 2 years we're still having inflation going gradually down, that will convince people that they can keep the dollars in their pockets instead of throwing away as soon as they can. But to lower inflation, you need to have at least the minimal demand for transactions. If everybody saves in dollars but transacts in pesos, you can conduct monetary policy. If people don't use pesos to transact, the demand for money collapses, and there is no way you can do monetary policy. In that case, the only alternative plan would be dollarization, but that comes spontaneously. If you don't have demand for money, then essentially you close the central bank, just let them use whatever money they're using right now. But so to lower inflation, you need to at least tell the people a story that is minimally credible, so that they wait to see inflation coming down. So as you see, it's more complex than just let me bring down inflation and wait. We need these people to stop reducing the demand for pesos. In the next year, as inflation comes down, they start reducing the velocity of transaction, increasing the demand for pesos. That would fuel back positively in our capacity to run monetary policy, because that means higher seniorage. That means that the central bank has more room to eliminate part of its debt. But so it's a two-way causality in a way. It's very difficult to do, and I think it will be the decision, the result, the final score will be apparent after 1 year. If we fail to stabilize in 1 year, even myself, that have been working and studying de-dollarization for 30 years, probably would give up and say, okay, let's dollarize and fuck it. That's all we're going to do.
Another technical question, very factual. You spoke about mining a couple of times. I mean, up to today, you see Chile being the number 1 producer of copper in the world. Argentina could be there. What are the things that actually make Argentina not a copper superpower, and why are your expectations that this is going to happen?
Well, the reason why the price of copper have gone up very recently, and it's going to stay there because of the energy, the climate change agenda, and the change in the way we produce and use energy. The reason why we're not investing more in Argentina in mining or anything else is that we cannot get the dollars out of the country, right? We have controls, outflow controls. So my impression is that if we can convince, let me put it this way, if we can engineer a special regime without the controls on outflows, that is minimally credible, because we already have the regime, but it's meaningless. People think the complication risk is still there. If we can convince these investors that they can get their money out when they are done, then we have a number of investors lining up to invest. We know them, they have been there, they have studied, they have sometimes purchased an option to develop those mines, but they're waiting for the exchange rate controls to clarify, so to speak, and to have a clear way out of the country once they're in. So I think that's that.
So in terms of the regulation of the sector, all of that is lined up and it's a macro situation that is limiting.
It's mostly that. It's true that you still, in some cases, because it's a provincial, the mining, all these natural resources are the provinces, they're owned by the provinces, so each province has its own regime. And there's, in some provinces, there are some social license problems that are still undecided. But the truth is that, provinces are producing. It's not the question, the shortage is not because of the social resistance. It's more that the money is not coming because who's going to invest in countries that have controls on outflows. So I think that, and the regulation is not that bad, really. It's not the regulation, it's investment. I mean, I've talked with investors and said, look, it's not, they tell me it's very simple. The only thing I need is to be sure they can take the dollars out. All the rest we can manage. And the same with investments in the downstream of Vaca Muerta, for instance, the liquefied gas, to export gas. I mean, now we will be able to use the gas ourselves, but ultimately we want to export it. We're essentially wasting gas every single year because we cannot actually transport it to final demand. We are going to use our demand next year because we built the dock, but we need to invest in liquefying factory to sell it to abroad. For that factory, I talked with the guy that's in charge of it, told me the only thing I need is that I can get the dollars out.
And the final question, do you think Argentinian society will support such an aggressive restructuring, reform, adjustment program as the one that you described?
No. But this is interesting and it's highly speculative. But I always compare two cases. In 2017, December 2017, we introduced a change in the way in which Social Security transfers were adjusted. And that was a tricky way because we are essentially, instead of looking backward, we're looking forward. We missed one quarter in the middle. So it was like, call it a picardia, economic, it was an economic trick to save some fiscal resources. And we had a demonstration of 5,000 people, very violent people in one of the main plazas in Buenos Aires. And that was terrible for the government. The government was weakened and terrified by that. I always compare that with Macron's two reforms. The first one was the labor reform, the second one was the Social Security reform. The Social Security reform, as far as I know, we have 1.5 million people with Molotovs on the streets. Right? It's not that I'm wishing that this will happen, but people don't like reforms ex ante. Sometimes they like them exposed, and the truth is that Macron recovered the image that they lost at the beginning of the reform, and then they have other accidents, but they were completely exogenous, like killing a poor guy by the police. The racism is something that's not Macron related, but the fact is that there is no way in which you will have support for reforms ex ante, and you will have to face social resistance. Now, how to manage social resistance is important. You have to be very tactful, right? And you have to be able to identify the real victims of the adjustment from these representatives who go to the plaza to protest, who are typically politically driven. But you won't have support. You will have to, part of our plan is think how you will manage the political resistance. But there is no way you will have consensus on reforms that affect the interests of the few for the benefit of the whole society. That never happens, and won't happen in Argentina. That shouldn't be the obstacle that justified not doing the reform.
Well, Eduardo, thank you very much. I mean, we'll be looking closely at the election and what comes next, and hopefully we'll have you back to tell us a more optimistic story in 2024.
Yeah, next year I will be here, and I will tell you how things went, and I will stay here if things didn't went well.
No, please.
Yeah, I wish that.